Hello, welcome to episode 5 of 10 Steps to Help Your Church Grow. In this episode, we're going to be talking about vision. And this is where we sort of turn a corner. In our first 4 episodes, we were talking about church culture, we were talking about prayer, purposeful prayer, and about establishing a healthy church culture. And we titled that section Laying a Foundation. One of the things about all 4 of those episodes, all 4 of those topics, prayer, church climate, conflict management, and celebrating success, those are all very much ongoing things. Those are things that can and should be started immediately and which will be a constant part of your developing and growing church as you move forward. That's not something that you're ever going to outgrow or stop doing. Those things aren't really a process. There's some process to it because it takes time for that change to take root. It takes time for the work that's going into those things to pay off in some cases. But they're not a process in the sense of moving from one step to another. They're all ongoing things that you start and continue. Now, as we enter into our next section, which we've titled Drafting Plans, as we continue that image of building a building or a house or a church, with vision, we start to get into something that is more of a process. Figuring out what vision is, what your vision, what your congregational vision is, that becomes the first step in a process. And so some of the things that we're going to talk about after this, actually both of the other things in this section on drafting plans, are things that are going to start after you've worked through some of the visioning. At least visioning should be ongoing. Your vision is something that you're going to interact with. It's something that you'll have to update periodically, but you'll have to establish, you have to figure out, you have to discern a vision before you can undertake the next steps. You can start changing the church climate before you've really had a ton of time to get your purposeful prayer going. You can start celebrating successes before your church climate has really changed appreciably. But for the steps in this section, you're really going to need to understand your vision before you can move on and really take on some of the steps after this. But step 5 is vision. And I almost don't like having it as a 5th step because it's so important. I did that because here's where we sort of get chronological and this becomes a building block for other things, whereas everything we talked about before this, it can start immediately and be ongoing. But vision is so important. In those 2 books that I mentioned as being really worthwhile, the Field Guide to the Missional Church and Comeback Churches, vision is what they address first. In fact, in the Comeback Churches book, they make it chapter 0. It's so foundational that they put it before they even start with the meat of the book. And vision, I think, is the first thing that they talk about in Field Guide for the Missional Church. Every church has a predictable life cycle. Churches start out like children, growing constantly. And eventually they stop growing. They become adults. And at first they can be vibrant, active, effective adults. And over time, just like happens with our physical bodies, the church starts to age. And as it ages, its focus becomes a little bit more on doing what it can to hold on to what it has. And over time, that body deteriorates and goes downhill and eventually, without any kind of intervention, dies. Like a human life cycle. For churches, though, they're not biological entities. There doesn't have to be that exact progression, because there are ways that you can step into the process and revitalize. And that's actually sort of the whole point of this whole series, right? If you're watching these, there's a very good chance that you're on the part of the life cycle curve where things are headed downhill. Fortunately, there are characteristics of each part of that life cycle that are very predictable. There's been a lot of research on this. If you're curious about the brass tacks behind it, go online and search life cycles of the church. You'll find more information than you'll be able to sift through. But there's a predictability. There are aspects of each category in that life cycle that are almost without exception always the case. And by changing characteristics, by addressing issues with your part of the curve, you can move around on the life cycle of a church. You can't really do that with a human body, unfortunately. I am old enough now that I would like to, if it were an option, which it isn't. But thankfully for our churches, it is. And so one of probably the most significant change that happens within a church's life cycle is a transition from being vision-oriented to being maintenance-oriented. And before we get too far into that, let's talk a little bit more about what a vision is. I guess I'm taking it for granted that you know that, and I shouldn't. Our vision is our picture, our idea, our ideal of how our church, how our specific congregation, how your specific congregation should be carrying out the universal mission of the church, universal. Jesus has given us a mission. As he was departing the earth, he told us to be his witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the world. He also told us to make disciples of all nations. So Jesus has given us a specific task. We should be bearing witness to his work, to what he's done. We should be going out and making disciples in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. How we do that is going to look very different depending on where we are. A rural church in India is going to look incredibly different from an urban congregation in New York City. The way that they do ministry is going to be different. The way that they make disciples is going to be different. The way that they bear witness is going to be different. Our vision as a church, as your church, the vision is how do we live out that mission that Jesus has given us? Now, you could have a mission that's different than making disciples. I mentioned in one of the previous videos that I'm not sure you're a church if your mission is anything other than making disciples of Jesus Christ. That was clearly what Jesus told us our mission is supposed to be. So if your mission is different than that, there, I think, will still be useful information for your organization in this video. But you can't help your church grow if you're not a church. So our mission from Jesus, our great commissioning, is to make disciples. But how we do that, how we live out that mission, is our vision. It's our understanding of who we as a congregation are called to be and how we're called to live out the mission that Jesus has given us. So who are our primary, I don't want to say targets because that sounds wrong, but who are the people that God is most calling us to be in ministry to? What are the needs of our community that God is calling us to address? What are the gifts? What are the strengths? What are the abilities that God has given to our congregation, both as a whole and individuals within the congregation? Our vision involves all of those things. How do we take what God has given us in this place where God has put us to address the needs of the people that God is calling us to? And how does all that translate to making disciples? So that's our vision. It's a goal. It's a picture. It's an image of what we as a church are called to be and how we're called to do it. And it might take some time to establish that vision. If you've lost sight of your vision for a long time, this might all sound foreign and maybe even a little bit overwhelming. Maybe we should be starting with something smaller. But that's our vision. Our vision is our goal, our image of who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to live out that mission. And anytime we have a vision, it's a positive, because getting back to the life cycle of the church, there is a clear distinction in that pattern. Churches and most organizations start out with a vision. People don't just plant a church for the sake of planting a church. They plant a church because they have a vision. They have a vision to reach a specific community, to meet their needs in one way or another. Hopefully, their vision is to make disciples in that community. But a church is founded because there's a vision for reaching a new community or reaching a new people within a community. And as long as the church remains oriented around that vision, it drives their decision making, it drives their desires, it energizes what they're doing. And the church, almost without exception, grows through that phase. And then it reaches maturity. It becomes as big as it's going to become, right? It reaches human adult size. I don't know why I said human. It reaches adult size. And it becomes its most effective. We, as human beings, experience that. We are our most effective once we become adults, early adults, adults that haven't started graying and losing hair and those sorts of things. We're most effective. And that's how churches are as well. But once you reach sort of that peak, once you're at your most effective and usually at your biggest, you start to lose sight of the vision, and the growth plateaus and it stops, and more focus, more and more energy moves away from those goals, moves away from growing into something and into maintenance. And some of that is necessary, right? You start getting buildings or doing additions on your building, and you have mortgages and you have staff. You've probably hired, you have a pastor and maybe an associate pastor or a music director. And there's all of these real needs that need to be addressed that require maintenance. But as energy shifts away from vision into maintaining what you have, growth freezes, you plateau, you hit a flat spot. And over time, the vision starts to die. You can maintain that for a little while. There's a moment of peak effectiveness where you can be addressing the maintenance of what you have while still holding on to that vision. Growth is already starting to decrease at that point, but you can still be effective in that spot. But over time, the vision starts to decrease. The vision starts to die off, and bit by bit, the church becomes more and more orientated towards maintaining what it has. And as it turns that corner, that's where the decline begins. The church begins to shrink. We're not reaching out. We're not bringing new people in. We're focusing on making sure the building's in good shape and all the bills are paid. And again, we need to do those things. We need to be responsible with our bills. But as we lose sight of that vision, and as our vision becomes more and more holding on to what we have, the church will always decline. Now, the good news is, like I said before, it's not a biological body. If we can reestablish vision, if we can grab back onto that old vision, or more often, even better, find a new vision, we can go back into a period of growth. We can stop plateauing, we can stop declining, and begin to experience new growth. But we need to have a vision. We need to transition away from just being focused on maintaining what we have to really being driven by that vision. I'll talk more about that in the next episode. But it's important for us, it's necessary, it's vital for us as churches to figure out what our vision is. Because without a vision, we have no choice but to be focused on maintenance. And unfortunately, a lot of times we think we have a vision and we don't. This is going to be an invitation for you to do some real introspection, to really reflect on your vision as an individual and as a congregation, because most churches wouldn't say we have no vision. They might be tentative to use the word vision, maybe because they don't fully understand what it means, or maybe because they recognize that that's kind of bigger than what they really have. But most churches, if you ask them what their vision is, they would say something like reaching new people, helping our community. Those are good things. They're not the thing, right? They're only part of what a real holistic vision that leads us towards making disciples really is, but they're good. The problem is, especially with we'd like to reach new people. The problem with that is more often than not, what they really mean is we want to get more people into the pews. And that in and of itself isn't completely a bad thing. We're going to talk about that later on when we get to evangelism and outreach. It is good for us to get new people into the church building. The problem is when people say their vision is to reach new people, usually, if they're being honest, if we're being honest with ourselves, what we really mean is we want to get more givers into the pews. And that's not really a vision. Or if it is, it's a vision that's oriented solely towards maintenance. If our goal is to get new givers into the pews, what we're really saying is our goal is to have enough money to keep doing what we've been doing. And that might be a certain kind of vision, but it's not the kind of vision that's going to bring a church together and unite them in mission. It's not the kind of goal that's really going to push people to make changes. In fact, it's a goal that's avoiding changes. You're saying staying the same is more important to us than being effective. So our goal is going to be to do as little change as possible in order to get enough money to keep doing things the way that we've been doing. And maybe that sounds a little bit cynical, and I hope that I'm being overly harsh, but it has been my experience that more often than not, when people say their goal is to reach new people, they're talking about having enough money to keep doing what they've been doing. And if we're honest, that's not enough. That's not good enough. And that's not the end goal that Jesus set for us. Our vision should include reaching new people, but not for the sake of maintaining what we have. We should be reaching new people for the sake of making new disciples. And that orients us differently. I don't want to talk too much about orientation. I feel like this video is already getting kind of long. And our next video is about reorienting ourselves. But for now, think about what is really your vision for your life, for your church. What is your congregation's vision? Do you have a vision statement? You probably do. If you do, what is it? How accurate is it to the strengths and abilities your church has? How accurate is it to the needs of your community? How accurate is it to the mission that Jesus has given to the universal church? If you don't have one, how can you go about building one? How can you go about developing one? And that's a big topic. It's hard to get a whole church to rally around one vision. Again, there are a lot of books that you can turn to that will help provide some guidance there. But the most important thing is just to start conversation. Gather a small group, talk about it in your board of elders or your church council or whatever, however your church is organized. Get your leaders talking about what your vision is. Where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? Who do you see yourself being called to minister to? What needs do you see in the community around you? What strengths and abilities has God given your church? How can you use those to reach people with the message of God's love and forgiveness? How can you use those to begin the process of building disciples? You need to start answering those questions, and you need to do it with enough church leaders that is not just your vision for where the church is going, but it becomes the church's vision. Churches need to have vision in order to be healthy, but it has to be something that's shared. It can't be one or two people's vision for where you're supposed to go. It has to be something that grows out of conversation with church leadership, that grows out of conversation with people in the pews and in the congregation. And once you have a vision that's starting to take shape, it needs to be held up. It needs to be shared and explained and celebrated. People from all aspects of the church, from paid staff to volunteer leadership to the people in the pews, to the folks joining you online, everyone should understand what the vision is. And it needs to become central. We'll talk more in reorientation about becoming central to the life of the church, but everyone needs to know what the vision is, and it has to be something that is mostly, or ideally completely, but at least mostly agreed upon And as the church begins to embrace that vision, it will drive change. It will drive new things. It'll drive revitalization. But you need that vision. You can't transition from decline back into health without discovering a vision, without discerning a vision for where God is calling you to go and how God is calling you to get there and how God has equipped you to do that. So start that work. Start it as soon as you can and involve as many willing participants as you can. It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary, and possibly more than any other thing that we'll talk about, it has the power to change the trajectory of where your church is headed right now.